Hi class, welcome to lecture 4, part B. So at the end of part A, we defined and discussed terrorism. Let's continue that discussion and let's go into possible reasons for the cause of terrorism. So why do individuals or non-state organizations turn to terror? That's what we're trying to figure out here. And we're going to go back to a term we've already discussed for a different topic. That is ideational reasoning for why groups or individuals commit acts of terror. Ideational would be strong beliefs. And I discussed this earlier that it's oftentimes religious ideology, perhaps an extreme ideology that there's some sort of apocalypse they need to get going or start, or perhaps even that it is congruent with their religion to commit acts of terror against people who don't believe. There's a ton of ideas. ISIL would be a great example of that in recent history. But I do again want to point out that not all ideational acts of terror are religious, but many are. Second possible cause for acts of terror, nihilism. That is the belief that all institutions and values are meaningless, and the only redeeming value is believed to be violence. So really a dark, macabre type of idea. You see this a lot of times with individuals who feel maybe rejected by society. And they say, the only thing I have left perhaps is violence. All values we hold and institutions are meaningless. Sometimes people associate this with anarchists, but I would say that not often do we see in modern history anarchists commit acts of terror. It doesn't really happen. 3, individual, and again, these are explanations for perhaps why we see acts of terrorism. We spoke a little bit about this concept before. That is the feeling of alienation or humiliation, personal experiences that generate grievances, frustrations, and a desire for vengeance. And at the end of part A, I asked, why are acts of terrorism increasing? So we're talking about domestic terrorism in the United States. I think this is a large reason why. We've had problems with bullying and such, but I think this is directly related also to the rise of social media, right? It's a very difficult time to grow up. Everything you do is recorded. And it's not like when I was a kid where if you got bullied, at least you got to go home at 3 and spend the rest of the day, not hearing about all that shit, right? Now you go home and you're on, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, whatever it is, and it follows you. And, cyberbullying is a very real and very harmful thing. Also, I think a lot of times people are very frustrated. They feel like, politically at least, their voice doesn't matter. Housing prices are going up while wages are staying stagnant, the wealth gap's growing. So there are legitimate grievances that people feel that perhaps sometimes lead them to certain types of violence or terror. Now, of course, that's not an acceptable way to deal with things. I'm not advocating it in any way whatsoever. I'm just trying to find an explanation for why some individuals turn to terrorism. And number 4, social benefits of membership. And again, I kind of mentioned this earlier in the lecture in part A, but oftentimes when people join a terror group, they get a sense of identity. They feel like they belong to something bigger than themselves. Perhaps they're somewhat of a loner, teased, bullied. Now they're a part of something powerful, something bigger than themselves, and important. What they might see as an important ideology gives them some sort of solidarity or even status. Could give them wealth, status, to where they're no longer nobody. Now they feel powerful. So in some countries, especially poor countries, you'll see, again, it's usually young men turn to terror for that sense of identity, for that status, for that sense of solidarity. So when we're talking about terrorism, we have to ask ourselves, does it work? Okay, and when I say work, I don't mean is this attack successful? I mean, does it achieve the goal it is attempting to achieve? Okay, does it complete the goal they want completed? And it depends on the situation, and we could say no. There's an argument for both sides. Of course, terrorism is never okay, but does it achieve its goals? Is what we're kind of asking. When we say no, it's very hard to find examples in history when acts of terror achieve dramatic change. If you want to change our political system and you kill a lot of people, terrorize the community, are people likely to say, yeah, let's do what they want to do? They seem like nice people. No. So for that reason, oftentimes, terrorism can actually deter people, can go against their goal. On the other side, does terrorism achieve its goals? You might say, in some ways, perhaps it does, because it can damage the country significantly, right? It can depress tourism, depress tourism, which can take a big economic hit depending on the country. It can deter FDI, other countries investing in your country, stock markets, and other things. It can increase anxiety, insecurity, and as people feel this anxiety, as their economy dips, that can erode state legitimacy. So if you're a terrorist in an organization, you want to replace the type of government you have, and you commit an act of terror, you are increasing anxiety and insecurity among the population. Perhaps you are harming the economy, so you are hurting the government, and you're eroding their legitimacy, and that perhaps makes it more likely that they will be overthrown. So in that way, you might say it achieves a goal. But again, are you going to ever change your type of government with terrorism? Probably not. Terrorism doesn't usually tend to work in the sense that it's going to achieve its ultimate goal. It might work in the short term by doing the things that we talked about here, like economic, social, and political hits. But ultimately, I think we can comfortably say that terrorism is rarely going to achieve its goals. Okay, so let's end the lecture here talking about religion and political violence. Why have we seen an increase in religious extremism and religious terror? There's a few different reasons, and it very much depends on the region and the group. A lot of that is wrapped up in hostility to modernity, meaning that they feel that their way of life is perhaps threatened, oftentimes by Western influence. The US, for example, the US is the most powerful country in the world, but also has a lot of soft power, cultural influence. And many countries feel like our culture has corrupted the traditions and values of their culture, right? So hostility to that change. Some groups believe, and I mentioned this before, in a cosmic world-ending war, and maybe it's their goal to get us there, or they view the modern world as dehumanizing their faith, etc. Some are for utopian, apocalyptic belief. There could be a million reasons as to why a certain religious organization might turn to violence. So some examples of violent religious fundamentalisms, we focused on the US today, so let's just keep that thread going. Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, obviously those responsible for the 9/11 attacks, which has been 20 years since, which is absolutely hard to believe. I cannot believe that was 20 years ago. Feels like it was 5 years ago. Those were Islamic extremist groups who committed that horrible atrocity. To look at other religious groups committing, or other religious individuals committing acts of terror. Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, he was a Christian. Now, his act of terror wasn't necessarily tied directly to Christianity itself, but he still was a Christian. So I think it's fair, if we're going to classify one group and identify them as a certain religion, we should do it with others as well. Buddhist terror groups, the 969 movement in Burma, which if you want to read more about, is somewhat interesting. So I included this short video. If you want to know more about the formation of ISIS or ISIL, we don't have a lot of time to go into the kind of origins and who they are and what they want, but I encourage you to watch that. Not mandatory, but I encourage you to watch that if you are curious. Okay, so how then should or does a state respond to terrorism? We've all heard the phrase, we don't negotiate with terrorists, etc. And a lot of states don't. But what is the most effective way to respond to terror? we're going to talk about two different responses: repression and reform. Starting with repression, and again, this is how states respond to acts of terror. Repression is when they violently crack down on terrorist groups, and I think this is probably the most common reaction to governments. They're going to go scorched earth. They're going to go after them, right? Because they find terrorism is unacceptable, both because it's extremely violent, and also because it delegitimizes their government. So the positive of this is it may solve the immediate threat. They might tamp out the immediate violence. The negative of this is it has collateral effect. It can encourage more resentment later, right? And I think the US invasion of Afghanistan might be an example of this, right? Immediately we bombed terrorist facilities, went after bin Laden, eventually got him. But when you occupy a country for 20 years, that's going to trigger resentment among younger populations that might in the future lead to political violence against the country. Okay. So repression is one way, but it also has some negatives as well. The second is reform. And this is essentially what the opposite of what that phrase says: negotiating with terrorism, changing your current practices to satisfy a terrorist organization. So essentially giving in and say, okay, we'll make these changes, but the violence must stop. The negatives of this is it may satisfy the immediate problem in stopping the violence, but won't that encourage more demands later, right? If it worked in this time, aren't they going to try it again, right? Aren't other groups going to do the same thing to get what they want because they saw it work? So this is where you get the term, we don't negotiate with terrorists, because the idea is if you negotiate with them, every time any terrorist organization wants something, they're just going to threaten the government and try to get it. Okay, so each form has its pros and cons. I would say the most common would be repression. Reform is more rare. We've seen this in some places, like Mexico, for example, right? The government has negotiated with cartel terrorist type organizations simply because they are so powerful. Okay, so that's going to wrap up lecture 4. Thanks for tuning in, and I will speak to you guys soon.